There's a certain kind of person who slows down when they see something old, not expensive, not rare, just old. A rusted truck sitting behind a barn with weeds growing around the tires. A watch that stopped ticking 20 years ago. A wooden chair with one loose leg leaning in the corner of a garage. Most people look at those things for half a second and mentally move on. Junk, scrap, too much work, not worth the trouble. But some people pause, not dramatically, quietly. Their eyes narrow a little. Their hand brushes across the surface almost automatically, like they're trying to feel something beneath the damage. And what's strange is that they don't seem disgusted by the wear. If anything, the wear is the part that interests them most. The chipped paint, the faded leather, the scratches, the parts that survived. Most people don't really understand this kind of person. They assume it's nostalgia, or stubbornness, or some romantic obsession with the good old days. Sometimes they call it impractical. Sometimes they call it a waste of time. And if the person spends entire weekends restoring old motorcycles or repairing radios nobody else would bother saving, people quietly start wondering why they care so much about objects that already had their time. But there's usually something much deeper happening underneath that behavior than people realize. Because men who restore old things often see the world differently. Not better, not worse, differently. And the psychology underneath that difference is surprisingly emotional. What makes this interesting is that restoring something is almost never just about the object itself. A man can spend 6 months rebuilding a truck he could replace in 3 days. Financially, it often makes no sense. Logically, it's inefficient. But psychologically, it satisfies something modern life rarely gives people anymore: visible progress. And strangely, that matters to some men far more than they realize. Researchers who study human motivation have noticed something important about the brain. People regulate stress better when effort leads to tangible feedback. Tighten the bolt, the vibration stops. Sand the wood, the surface smooths out. Reconnect the wire, the light comes back on. The brain likes this because the world suddenly becomes understandable again. Modern life often feels abstract. You send emails that disappear into silence. You sit in meetings where nothing changes. You have conversations where nobody says what they actually mean. Problems linger without shape. Stress accumulates without resolution. But restoration is different. It creates a direct relationship between effort and reality. And for certain men, that relationship feels deeply stabilizing. Not because they care more about objects than people, but because machines rarely hide what's wrong with them. People do. There's another layer to this that most people miss entirely. The men who restore old things are usually not trying to erase age. They're trying to preserve identity. That sounds philosophical, but it shows up in very ordinary moments. A man restoring an old truck often leaves one scratch untouched because his father put it there 30 years ago. Someone rebuilding an old watch keeps the worn dial instead of replacing it because the wear tells a story. They rarely say, "I want it to look new." They say, "I want to bring it back." That difference matters psychologically because new means replacement. Bring it back means recovery. And human beings form emotional attachments not only to objects, but to continuity, to evidence that something meaningful survived time. Old objects carry continuity inside them, especially for men raised in homes where emotions were rarely spoken directly. And this pattern usually starts much earlier than people think. In some households, affection was not verbal. Nobody sat down and explained emotions carefully. Love appeared as repaired brakes, changed oil, a rebuilt porch, a heater fixed before winter came. For a lot of men, care was demonstrated through maintenance, not language, and years later, without fully realizing it, they continue speaking the same emotional dialect they inherited. Through repair, through restoration, through saving things other people would throw away. There's usually a memory underneath it somewhere. A garage with cold concrete floors, a basement workbench, a grandfather sorting screws into old coffee cans, a father silently focused under the hood of a car while a baseball game played quietly in the background. And what the child absorbed in those moments was not only mechanical skill, it was emotional orientation. The lesson was, when something breaks, you stay. You don't leave at the first sign of damage. You learn the sound the problem makes. You stay long enough to understand it. That philosophy settles into the nervous system more deeply than people think. Behavioral psychologists have long understood that children absorb emotional regulation indirectly. They learn how to react to stress, not from lectures, but from observation. A calm man fixing something teaches calmness without saying a word. A frustrated man throwing tools teaches frustration the same way. And over time, some boys begin associating repair with safety itself. Not consciously, their body just learns. Problems can be approached. Damage can be understood. Broken does not automatically mean hopeless. That becomes part of their identity long before they have language for it. But there's a paradox hiding inside this kind of personality. Some men can spend years bringing dead machines back to life while quietly ignoring the parts of themselves falling apart. Because restoration feels safer when the problem is external. An engine does not judge you. Wood does not reject you. Machines are honest. If a carburetor is failing, it fails consistently. If a wire is loose, there is a reason. Human emotion is rarely that clean. And some men who are incredibly patient with broken objects become deeply uncomfortable around emotional uncertainty. Not because they lack feelings. Usually the opposite. They feel too much and have no clear blueprint for where to put it. So they return to places where effort still makes sense. The garage, the workshop, the driveway, the shed behind the house. People sometimes mistake this for emotional avoidance. Sometimes it is, but often it's emotional regulation. There's a difference. For a few hours, the mind finally stops scattering itself across everything that feels unresolved. That's why some men can spend 7 hours restoring an old motorcycle and emerge calmer than they've felt all week. The object becomes a container for mental order, a way to hold the world steady for a while. And here's the strange part. A lot of these men are not actually trying to restore the object. They're trying to restore a feeling, and interestingly, the older the object is, the more emotionally satisfying the process often becomes. Because older things carry resistance, they fight back, they require patience, they demand interpretation. Modern products are usually designed for replacement. Old things were designed for endurance. And whether consciously or unconsciously, many men identify with that. Especially men who grew up believing their own value depended on usefulness. That matters more than people realize. A man who is praised mainly for being capable often develops a complicated relationship with brokenness. Part of him respects durability. Part of him fears becoming unnecessary himself. So restoring old things becomes symbolic in ways he may never fully articulate. If this old truck still matters, if this worn-out watch still has purpose, if this damaged thing can still be brought back carefully instead of discarded, then maybe usefulness is not the only thing that gives something value. Maybe age itself carries meaning. Maybe surviving matters too. That realization sits very quietly inside a lot of restoration work. And it explains something subtle people notice around these men. Most of them are unusually patient with objects and unusually hard on themselves. They'll spend 3 weekends fixing a radio nobody else cares about while quietly dismissing their own exhaustion as weakness. They can see potential in damaged things everywhere except in themselves. And that contradiction is incredibly common among highly competent men. Not because competence removes insecurity, sometimes competence becomes the strategy used to manage it. There's another misunderstanding worth clearing up. People often assume men who restore old things dislike modern life. That's usually not true. What they're reacting to is disposability, not just of products, of attention, of relationships, of meaning. Modern culture moves fast, faster every year. Things become obsolete almost immediately. Conversations shorten, patience shrinks. Restoration moves in the opposite direction. It asks for slowness, observation, care, tolerance for imperfection. And psychologically, that can feel deeply grounding in a culture that rarely slows down long enough for people to feel connected to anything, especially themselves. There's a reason these men often prefer quiet spaces, not because they hate people, because silence allows attention to deepen, and attention, when sustained long enough, naturally becomes emotional. That's why a man sanding down an old table at midnight can suddenly find himself thinking about his father, or his divorce, or the version of himself he used to be before life became mostly responsibility. The hands stay busy, the mind opens quietly. A lot of emotional processing happens that way, not through analysis, through rhythm. And strangely, many men trust emotions more when those emotions arrive beside work rather than face-to-face conversation. That doesn't make them emotionally shallow. People often assume men who restore old things dislike modern life. That's usually not true. What they're reacting to is disposability, not just of products, of attention, of relationships, of meaning. Modern culture moves fast, faster every year. Things become obsolete almost immediately. Conversations shorten, patience shrinks. Restoration moves in the opposite direction. It asks for slowness, observation, care, tolerance for imperfection. And psychologically, that can feel deeply grounding in a culture that rarely slows down long enough for people to feel connected to anything, especially themselves. There's a reason these men often prefer quiet spaces, not because they hate people, because silence allows attention to deepen. And attention, when sustained long enough, naturally becomes emotional. That's why a man sanding down an old table at midnight can suddenly find himself thinking about his father, or his man. It means their emotional system developed around movement, focus, and task orientation rather than verbal processing. Different nervous systems organize emotion differently. That is not pathology, it's variation. And none of this means restoring old things is inherently wiser than any other way of living. Some people heal through conversation, some through art, some through travel, some through building families, some through restoring forgotten objects in silent garages while rain hits the roof overhead. Human beings regulate themselves in different ways. No single pattern owns the truth. But there is something quietly beautiful about the kind of person who sees damage and instinctively wonders whether something can still be saved. Not everyone thinks that way anymore, and maybe that mindset carries value far beyond machinery or furniture or old trucks. Because underneath all restoration is a refusal to believe that worn out automatically means worthless. Some men spend their entire lives restoring old things because deep down they hope people work the same way, that damaged things can still return, that time alone does not make something worthless. The interesting thing is that most men who restore old things would never describe themselves this deeply. If you ask them why they do it, they'd probably shrug. They'd say, "I just like working on stuff." And they would genuinely mean it, because the deepest parts of human psychology are often lived long before they're understood. The nervous system develops habits first. Language comes later. So the man restoring a motorcycle in his garage may never fully realize that what he actually built over the years was not mechanical skill alone. He built patience, tolerance for frustration, respect for process, the ability to stay present with damaged things without immediately giving up on them. That way of seeing affects more than objects. It affects marriages, friendships, fatherhood, aging, loss. Sometimes it even affects the way a person survives difficult years without completely hardening. And maybe that's the real reason certain men feel strangely peaceful while restoring old things. For a few quiet hours, the world becomes understandable again. The broken thing has shape. The damage has logic. The solution exists somewhere, even if it takes time to find. And deep down, maybe part of them hopes the same thing is true for people too. Because once you understand what these men are really searching for when they restore old things, you start noticing how many people are quietly trying to restore themselves too. Isko is tara likhu ke isko voice karte waqt zyada pose na ke matlab jildi jildi bole.